Hello again, chess fans, and welcome back to ChessExtra.com. I'm Mackenzie, and today I'd like to show you an endgame that I was looking at recently that I really very inspiring. And the topic of the lecture is Checkmate in the endgame. And the reason I'm talking about this is that I think that a lot of players are not really aware, or not as aware as they could be, of the extent to which you can use checkmate threats in the end game. You know, a lot of us think that checkmates happen in the middle game. You know, you have exciting mating attacks and so forth. And the end game's a little bit different. You typically don't have mating attacks in the end game, but what you can have is situations where one side has a king that's poorly placed and that's in constant danger of being checkmated. And that fact forces the player to make concessions in other ways, which then end up being fatal. So it's, as I said, it's a little different in that you won't actually see the checkmates happen over the board, or you won't see the player resigning because they're going to get mated. But instead what you'll see is that the endgame will slip out of their control because of the bad king position. Of course, also the flip side is that in the end game, you can also have really good king position. So in the middle game, you don't use the king, or it's ultra rare to use the king as an attacker. But in the end game, he can be a terrific attacker. And in the game we're going to look at today, basically the king serves as an extra piece. So the game I want to show you was played in 2008 in the Olympiad that year between Alexei Shirov, who was white, and Veselin Topalov, who was black. And exciting game, but especially the end game, as I said, was really fascinating. So we're going to start looking at the game on white's 24th move. So black has just moved his rook to a3, obviously threatening the pawn on a2, also defending the pawn on a7. And so the question is, what's white going to do about this? And the interesting thing is that I believe that probably, this is completely unscientific, I don't know for sure, but I think probably 90% of amateur players would do the wrong thing here. So they would either just sort of automatically drop their rook back to defend the pawn, or maybe they would trade rooks and then defend the pawn with their other rook. But either one of those is really a bad idea, because black is now going to play knight to c6, he's going to play a5, he's going to play knight to b4, and all of a sudden he's going to have all this pressure on the weak squares in white's position, the weak pawn on a2 and the pawn on d3. And it's going to be a real struggle for white to hold this endgame, even though he's got, supposedly got the advantage of a bishop for a knight. It isn't always the case. In this case, it's not. So what is white to do here? Well, Shirov came up with a great solution. And, to understand his solution, you have to really think about the position and think about what are white's advantages in this position. So, does white have an advantage? Maybe he doesn't, because white has so many weak pawns. He's got the pawn on h4, he's got the pawn on d3, he's got the pawn on a2. Maybe this is just too big an issue. But white does have some advantages, and one big advantage is his active rook on the 7th rank. And so basically what Shirov said is, if I can bring my other rook up to join it, then I'm going to have a really strong attacking force. And in particular, black is going to be in trouble because of his knight, which is difficult to defend, and because of his king, which is kind of stuck here on the back rank and has real difficulty escaping. Black would love to get his king out to g7, where it would be safe, but the king is needed on f8 to defend the knight. And as long as the king is sort of stuck there on f8, he's going to be in trouble, in danger. So a very far-sighted analysis by Shirov, and the move he plays then is rook to c1. So basically he's saying, I'm willing to sacrifice a pawn with check in order to activate my rook. And I'm going to sacrifice the h-pawn too if black wants it. So he's, not only is he not defending the pawn that's being attacked, he's offering another one. So very impressive concept. Okay, so Topalov, of course, takes the free pawn. I mean, a free pawn, a free tempo. So king to e3. And now we have an interesting position. So should black take the extra pawn? Well, Topalov didn't, but let's see what would have happened if he did. So rook takes h4. White will, of course, play rook to c7. And then black's best move is to go rook takes pawn. And now what does white do? Well, you better be careful here, because it would be very easy to get careless and play a move like bishop to f3, which seems to gain a tempo attacking black's rook, and walks straight into a checkmate, d4 checkmate. So here's another aspect. Now here's another example of checkmate in the endgame. So it can go both ways, and so you just have to be alert. Whenever you have multiple pieces, 2 rooks, or 2, 3 minor pieces in the endgame, even though you need the king to be a fighting piece, nevertheless, you always have to watch out for the possibility of checkmate. So, of course, white should not be playing defensively here. White should be attacking. And so the logical move is to play rook takes knight. And, in fact, this move wins. So if black goes rook takes bishop, and notice black is 3 pawns up. White has sacrificed 3 pawns to get to this position. But white wins by force. Rook takes pawn check. And if king goes to e8, then white checkmates with rook to h7. So, and notice this idea of having the rooks on each side of the king. So if black plays rook takes pawn in order to interpose on f8, well, it doesn't work because white can check on the other side. And so there's again, your checkmate in the endgame. And likewise, if black goes the other way, again, white needs to be a little bit careful. Okay, so if he goes rook to c7, then black will play rook takes pawn. And again, black has this idea of interposing on f8. So instead, it's better to first check on g7. And then this forces the king either to h8 or to f8. And then you can play rook to c7. And now there's no defending mate for black, because rook takes pawn, rook back, and you can interpose, but it's not defended anymore. And so white gets a checkmate. Okay, so this shows that white's 2-pawn sacrifice really is sound, and black cannot afford to take that second pawn. So as I said, you can't really call this a mating attack, because black sees through this, realizes he can't take the pawn, and he does something different instead. What he does is actually quite instructive. He plays d4 check, which is a very nice move. So black also is not too worried about counting pawns. Okay, so in the endgame, it's all about piece activity, and it's all about getting your passed pawns going if you have them. So d4 check. Now, if white takes the pawn, black would be very happy, because he would take on f2, and this defends the big weak spot in black's position. And as long as he can keep that defended, he's going to be all right. He can't really lose as long as that pawn is defended on the f-file. Okay, and also it's nice that the rook is threatening the bishop, and so this gains a tempo as well for black. Okay, so d4 check. Very nice move for black. But of course, white doesn't take the pawn. So Shirov sees this, and he plays another remarkable move, king to f4. So, so now he's already sacked a pawn. He's declined black's pawn sacrifice, and he's now offering 2 more pawns for sacrifice, at either f2 or h4. So, what's gotten into this guy anyway? Well, of course, he's Shirov. You expect this from Shirov. But it's just really impressive to see that you can do this sort of thing in the endgame. Okay, so now here, actually, I think black made a mistake. I think that black should go ahead and take one of those pawns. So sometimes, okay, sorry, I'm getting ahead. Rook h7 is what he did, which I think is a mistake. I think he should have played rook takes pawn check. Sometimes you just got to take the material. It's actually can be the right thing to do. Okay, so 2 points to this move. First of all, if the king retreats, no, 3 points. If the king goes forward, then you get checkmated again. So again, never forget that you can get checkmated in these multi-piece complicated endgames. Second point, if the king goes back to g3, then the rook can go to f6, and black, I believe black is okay here because he's got the rook defending the f-pawn from in front. And that means the other rook, that means black will be free to play king g7 and activate his other rook. Now, this could get a little bit dicey because the black rook doesn't have a whole lot of squares on this file. And, for example, white can play g5 and kick the rook around a little bit. But I've done some analysis in the PGN file, and I think that black can hold this. And I think this was the way that Topalov should have played. Now, another interesting possibility for white is bishop to f3. And here white is saying, nah, I'm not going to let you defend the f7 pawn with that rook. And now again, things get pretty hairy. And I can understand why Topalov didn't play this. But once again, I think the solution is to grab the material. Okay. The idea here is that if white continues with doubling his rooks on the 7th rank, black is also going to get his rooks organized. And after rook takes knight, rook takes bishop check, king runs away. I think that white is all right here. Black is all right here, I should say. White's all right too. But I think black is holding this game because he's not in any danger of being checkmated as long as he's got those rooks on the f-file. So black may drop a pawn or two, but that's okay. He's 3 pawns ahead to start with. So I think this is equal. Another possibility here for white that also doesn't work would be king g3, rook h2, rook down, and rook check, king f4, rook to f2, and we're back in the same situation as in that other line. So basically, I think after rook takes h4, black is holding the game. But this was, of course, very tricky to calculate, pretty scary. And the other side of the coin, too, is, okay, so as I said, Topalov played rook h7, which, you know, the other side of the coin is it's not at all obvious that this move is bad. And it's a great credit to Shirov that he was able to win from this position. In fact, I think it's a forced win for white from here. But I don't think too many people would be able to look at this position and realize that. So it's a case where rook h7 is worse than it looks, and rook takes f2 check is better than it looks. So, of course, it's also, you know, it's rather unusual for Topalov to commit the sin of playing too defensively. He's the last person you'd expect that from. But it just shows, you know, all of us are human. We can all miscalculate. So let's see how Shirov manages to win this game. Okay, so first move is obvious, rook to c7, doubling on the 7th rank. Knight to d5 check. Obviously, bishop takes knight is forced. Pawn takes bishop. And now white plays f3. And I think this is a cute little move. Of course, I mean, obviously white wants to save his pawn on f2. But really what's more important is that he's, as I keep saying, he's preventing black from protecting the pawn on the f-file. So this means the pawn's only defender is the rook at h7. And this keeps black from getting his pieces organized. You know, so he'd like to go king to g7, but that just loses everything after rook takes f7 check. So black plays a5, and I really can't see anything better for him. Obviously, I think he should try to get that passed pawn rolling as fast as possible and hope to force white to defend. But white isn't going to defend. He plays h5, exclamation point. And now we're going to see a little bit more of this mating theme in the endgame. So, of course, white's threat is he wants to go pawn takes pawn, which would fork the rook and the pawn, and would be exceedingly bad news for black. Now, in any ordinary situation, black would be able to just defend the pawn with rook to g7, but that fails here because of checkmate. So again, you can't really call this a mating attack for white. He's never actually going to get to play the checkmate, but the threat of checkmate forces black into some really awkward moves, and that enables white to win the game. Okay, so black plays pawn takes pawn. That's sensible. And now stop here and think what you're going to do next for white. Okay, so it'd be very easy to play the automatic recapture pawn takes pawn, but that's no good. That move does not win because black would defend with his other rook, and black should be able to hold this position. So instead, the correct move is g5. And this is just extraordinary chess. Once again, Shirov is not about counting pawns. He's 2 pawns down. He doesn't care because he's playing for either checkmate or for huge win of material. Okay, and here's another way of looking at it. One reason white is winning this game, even though he's 2 pawns behind, is that his king is so much more active than black's king. As I said, black's king is stuck. He can't move. He moves, he loses. So, and meanwhile, white's king is going to march to f5 and it's going to march to f6. And so white's king is very much like an extra attacking piece. So as an attacker, the king is roughly, I've seen it said, the king is about as strong as a knight. So white isn't 2 pawns down. He's up a piece for 2 pawns. And that's why white is winning. So this is great stuff, very educational, and really cool to see how Shirov pulls this off. Okay, Topalov plays rook to g2. Obviously, he needed to stop the advance g6. All right, so Shirov just marches his king up, king to f5. And now the threat is simply to go king to f6 and set up a mating net. So once again, the threat of mate is enough to force black to make a concession, and he goes rook to e7. Okay, so his idea now is that if white goes king f6, he's going to go rook to e6 check, chase the king back, and white has not made progress. Also, there's a tricky point here, which is that white does not want to play g6 because of pawn takes pawn check. All right, so it's note that it's check now, and so black is able to do this. The pin no longer applies, and black can then trade off a pair of rooks. And then as soon as the rooks have been traded, now black stands better. Black is probably winning. I'm pretty sure of it. So, did Shirov miss this? Well, no, he has another idea, which is rook to f8 check. And now notice that if king to g7, now g6 is lights out because the pawn is once again pinned. And so rook takes pawn check is going to follow. And as I said, it's very, very bad news for black. So instead, black is forced to play rook to e8. And now the game is over in just a couple moves. Rook takes rook check. King takes rook. King f6. So white has achieved everything he could ask for. He's turned his king into a powerful attacking piece. And basically, black's king is not in a mating net, but he's got to give up major material to avoid the promotion of this pawn. So black plays h4. It's the idea of trying to queen it, but it's too little too late. White goes g6. Of course, pawn takes pawn is out of the question because even though black's got all these extra pawns, white's rook would easily be able to cope with them. So black plays one last gasp trick, which is rook to h6, pinning the g-pawn, but that doesn't work. White just goes rook takes pawn. And here black resigned. The reason black resigned is that if he tries to queen his pawn, white's just going to play rook to h7. And if rook takes rook, pawn takes rook, I don't care that black's, a pawn up because white queens first. Okay, and that's the ball game. Or if black tries the desperado rook sack, again, that's just not going to work because black's pawns are too scattered. They can't possibly compete against white's rook. So a wonderful endgame by Shirov, definitely showing the creativity and the willingness to sacrifice that makes him famous. But here it's a sacrifice in the endgame, and you don't expect to see that so much. But as we've seen, white was perfectly willing to give up as many as 3 pawns simply to activate his king and to get mating threats. And those threats ultimately force black to capitulate. So for chesslecture.com, this is Dana Mackenzie signing out.